So this podcast moves on to explore a new qualitative method, the method of ethnography. So the use of interviews and the analysis of cultural texts are key ways in which social researchers attempt to access meanings and understandings of the social world. And they do this by accessing what people say about this social world. Interviews tend to draw our attention towards rationally thought through explanations. Research becomes focused on individuals' considered responses to questioning and on the ways their world is planned, edited and modified through rational thought through explanation. So this research approach remains vital as it sheds key light on key aspects of lived experience. However, it's also partial, as it tends to draw our attention away from the everyday impulses, habitual practices and unthought through actions that go together to make up our world. We're also limited in part by language in how it can faithfully represent or indeed misrepresent our thoughts and feelings. If we only ask people to say a particular response, we're limited by their ability to communicate effectively and make sense of the world in which they live. This is articulated by the actor Ryan Reynolds. The way I talk, he says, I never seem to say things directly. I don't know if it's the same for everyone who's getting interviewed, but I look at interviews I've done and they don't read at all like how I feel about the world. Every interview I do, I look at and think, well, that's not really how I feel, so why does it say that? I must have said it, but maybe I'm bad at communicating. There is, therefore, another language which we might choose to use to contribute to our understanding of our research subject, to get beyond the language of the word. This other language is hinted at in interviews where communication before or beyond the verbal occurs, through perhaps the blink of an eye or the shrug of a shoulder. This other communication is the language of the world, we might say, and it involves a different set of methods to be adopted by social researchers in order to access it. So if your research inquiry seeks to examine what people do as well as what they say they do, and also to want to involve in the intellect and as well as emotions, to get at the senses and atmospheres of the social world, and also get at practices and what those practices might feel like, then ethnography is a qualitative method you may wish to consider. So up until the turn of the 21st century, many research projects tended to concentrate on the language of the word in isolation. As Alan Nathan points out, from these studies what really mattered was talk. However, human life also includes the complexities of cultural practice, the feelings that we have before or beyond verbal communication, the blushes, the goosebumps, the shivers, as well as emotions, impulses and movements that affect us every day. So communication and meaning is not only generated by thought through and intentioned activity, but also by mundane and habitual acts whose conscious motivation may have been forgotten, if it ever existed in the first place. So by using methods that seek to access only the language of the word, these other languages are either ignored, silenced or mistranslated into a form of communication that often does not do them justice. Interest in languages before and beyond the representational have therefore led to research methods other research methods becoming popular within social research. And a key method is ethnography. So ethnography is a research method that seeks to not only explore what people say, but also what they do. It seeks to evaluate and investigate the constitution and preferences of different social groups by engaging in their practices, their emotions, and their senses of place. So the basic method of ethnography is to understand parts of the world as they're experienced and understood in the everyday lives of people who actually live them out. It's to put ourselves in the shoes of those people in that world and understand the world and actual ways of life from the inside, if you like, in the context of everyday lived experiences. So in order to appropriately understand these experiences, ethnography involves a number of key elements. In its most characteristic form, it involves the ethnographer participating in people's daily lives for an extended period of time. Ethnographers watch what happens, they listen to what's said, they ask questions. In fact, they collect whatever data is available to throw light on the issues that are the focus of their research. So ethnography involves participation in the social world under study. As we've already acknowledged in this podcast series already, we're all involved in that social world. However, in ethnography, our involvement in the respondent's world is explicit and clear. Ethnographers gain their insight through becoming part of that world, spending time in their places and becoming part of their social group. Through sharing in their lives in this way, participation allows ethnographers to acquire a native competence about the culture they're interested in. And through this participation comes our comprehension and understanding. As Herbert outlines, ethnography provides brilliant insight into the processes and meanings that sustain and motivate social groups. Ethnography also requires an extended period of time to gain this understanding, especially when compared to interviews or other forms of cultural analysis. Getting under the skin of culture, understanding its meanings, its practices and unstated rituals cannot be achieved in a few hours or even an afternoon. Although there's no minimum amount of time required for ethnography, time lengths often depend on a researcher's literacy of the culture and the representative of the time they spend in that social world. In whatever circumstance, ethnography often requires a great time commitment. So ethnography often involves a lot of time, and it also involves a combination of participation and observation. In some cases, researchers will adopt a complete participant position, becoming part and parcel of the world under study, and often they will adopt a complete observer position, for example as a legal observer at a rally or a demonstration. However, it's more common for a researcher to adopt a mixed position, both participating and observing at times during the study. As Cook explains, ethnography commonly involves researchers moving between participating in a community by deliberately immersing themselves in its everyday rhythms and routines, developing relationships with people who can show and tell them what's going on there, and also writing accounts of how these relationships develop and what was learnt from them, and on the other hand observing that community by sitting back, watching activities unfold, recording their impression of these activities in field notes, tallies, drawings and photographs, and other forms of material evidence. So ethnography thus involves both participation and observation over time in order to understand a social group. However, because the research is the product of the interrelationship between us as researchers and the world out there, this method often presents a number of difficulties for the researcher. When doing ethnography, for example, researchers live in two worlds. They live in their world of college or university and in the world they're studying. So although they remain part of their college and university world, they become distanced to it due to their new positioning in the world out there. Similarly, although they are part of that world under study, their observation and questioning of it somehow also distances them from that world. Ethnography therefore places the researcher in a difficult position. Which side are they really on? Will they go native, leaving their research project to become a permanent part of the social world they're studying? What responsibilities do they have to the relationships in each place? How desirable is it just to leave the world they're studying when the research project is complete? So doing ethnography therefore makes explicit the emotional, personal and very real attachments research creates between it and the world at large. These attachments become embodied within individual researchers, their own fully human nature making the research project both an intellectual as well as an emotional and personal event. Ethnography emphasises that scholars are not dispassionate and disembodied. Rather, as Linda McDowell tells us, they are touched by relations of power, feelings of jealousy, envy, doubt, love and possession. So these embodied emotions cannot be hidden or ignored by the ethnographer. Rather, they can be used and harnessed to give new insight into what the experience of that social group is like. So through the use of the ethnographic and embodied techniques, glimpses of the language of the world can be brought into our inquiry. The thought through is combined with the impulsive and the intuitive. A bricolage of languages is employed to understand the lived experience of that world. By attempting to access this lived experience, these methods seek to convey not just what it means to live within a particular group, but also what it's like to live there. In this way, social research can include our bodies in our writing and responses. It can also not only simply engage our mind, but perhaps our heart and soul too. So ethnography normally involves placing the researcher in a strange social group to find out about that different cultural amalgam, perhaps a group of bikers were protesters or an African tribe. However, ethnography doesn't have to be that exotic and can be far more everyday. Going out into the field doesn't need to involve getting on a plane to a faraway place. The field can be closer to home than you think. So ethnography therefore does not have to be about social groups in faraway places. It can be about our own groups, in our own backyards. Indeed, it can also be about ourselves, in our own lives. This is when ethnography becomes autoethnography. So the concept of autoethnography has a double sense. It can refer either to the ethnography of one's own group, or it can be about autobiographical writing that has a social interest. So Ellis suggests that researchers can conduct autoethnography whenever it allows us to be able to think about our own life in relationship to the study that we're interested in. Perhaps we want to tell our own stories, record our own experiences of an interview, of ethnography itself, about how we're affected by observing and studying the social world. Through this way, we might bring ourselves to our research projects more closely and more directly. We might use our feelings, our thoughts, and bodily emotions and write them into our studies. Therefore, through ethnography, we might create a more artistic form of practice. We might evoke the emotional response in our readers. We might also give voice to stories and groups of people traditionally left out of social science inquiry, and write a form of writing that is perhaps less scientific and more literary and artistic in nature. So writing an autoethnography is about writing our own lives in relation to the world out there, using ourselves as a source of information, using my experience perhaps in the way that I would use our research respondents' experience to link empirical ideas with conceptual notions. This isn't necessarily a narcissistic or a navel-gazing exercise, but it's making explicit and clear the connections that we've already talked about in this series of ourselves and our research and our scholarly questions with the world out there. It's about bringing those two worlds together. So the emotions felt and the practices experienced through ethnography and autoethnography are often articulated in field diaries. And Cook and Crang outline field diaries as some sort of record to chart how our research progresses day by day, showing how the researcher comes to certain understandings or misunderstandings, representing the doubts, fears, concerns and feelings that the researcher has at all stages of their work. The field diary might show how our understandings are affected by particular perspectives, or how our positionality evolves in that social community, how power relations affect what questions we might ask or what answers we might get, how people respond to us when we're part of that research community, and how the research encounter makes us feel, how it affects what we do, what we dream about, what rumours that come back to us from the circulating gossip within that research community, and how these factors change over time. So field diaries are often used to keep an account of experiences within the social groups that we study, from writing scrambled notes on scraps of paper through to longer, more reflexive pieces. The field diary comes to capture the flavour and sense of being in that social group. When reading it back, it offers a window or a portal back into that three-dimensional context, offering a view to the resonant emotions conjured up when we're in that expanded field. If you want to know more about conducting field diaries and doing ethnography in practice, the following resources may prove useful.